We're looking at Pascal theology in two parts, Old and New Testament. The first will be simply the Old Testament without any reference to the New, and the second will be the New Testament interpretation of it from the point of view of Judeo-Christianity. Pascal comes from the Hebrew Pesach. However, etymologically, Pesach is not a word of Hebrew origin. It is a word of Egyptian origin. Egyptologists usually think it comes from the word pesh, to spread over. To spread over, again, an Egyptian word. Hence, Pascal comes from Pesach, the Egyptian word pesh, in its earliest origins. Okay. This has absolutely no reference to Easter, as we'll see in our second lecture today. Okay. Turn with me, please, to the book of Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. We have to understand the reasons why God gave these holy days as He did in the order He gave them, commencing with Passover. The first month of the Hebrew calendar is the month of Nisan, roughly corresponding to late March, early April. Again, following a lunar calendar of 28 days. Okay? Nisan is the first. The first of Nisan was the biblical New Year for the Jews. The rabbis later changed it to Rosh Hashanah in the Middle Ages, but biblically it's the first of Nisan. The 14th of Nisan, 14th of the first month of the year, is Passover, or Pesach. Passover, or Pesach. Now again, we have to put it into a context. We're not going to talk about typology or New Testament eschatology, what it means dispensationally and things of this nature. That's not our purpose. The first part, we're simply looking at Paschal theology in its own setting within the Hebrew Scriptures. You had Pesach, followed by a 7-day period of no eating of leaven. This is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Hag Matzot. Hag Matzot. Hag, literally holiday. Matzot, unleavened bread. Okay? 7-day period. The first day of that week of unleavened bread is first fruits. The Sunday is the first day of the week by the Jewish calendar, and it is called first fruits. Okay? 7 weeks later, and then the morrow day, after the 49th day, you have Hag Shavuot, known to Christians as Pentecost, but in Hebrew it's the Feast of Weeks. These constitute the 3 spring holidays of Leviticus 23 and 24. No more holidays in the original Hebrew canon until the autumn. The others are not important for us today, being the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Booths, Hag Sukkot, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and Hag Sukkot. We're only concerned with these for purposes looking at Passover. Okay. However, bear in mind there were 3 autumn holidays. They were of this nature for the following reason. When Moses wrote them, he was writing to a society that followed an agricultural calendar and an agricultural annual cycle. In the Middle East, you have 2 harvest seasons, the spring harvest and the autumn harvest. Okay? These holy days, these festal days, including commencing with Passover, correspond to important days in the annual agricultural cycle. They are to be understood as a polemic against paganism. A polemic against paganism. The other civilizations of the Near East, particularly the Canaanites, they had holy days the same days of the year. Only instead of thanking Yahweh, who the Hebrews held to be the one true God, for the rain and the sun and the harvest, they were giving the thanks to other gods. So Moses instituted these days, and when he instituted them, they were a polemic against paganism. Okay? Polemic is an argument, a scholarly argument against something. It was a polemic against paganism. Okay? Now, let's begin looking at this first holy day. Remember, it follows the annual agricultural cycle of the former and latter rain, of the two harvests, and so forth. Now, Leviticus chapter 23, please. Verse 4, these are the appointed times of the Lord, holy convocations which you shall proclaim at the times appointed for them. In the first month, that is Nisan, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, is the Lord's Pesach, or Passover. Then on the 15th day of the same month, there is a Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work, but for 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. On the seventh day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. Now, let's understand what this would have meant to a Jew. Doing no laborious work would have carried the idea that it was a Sabbath, a special kind of Sabbath. Only Sabbath comes from the word seven, Sheva. Shabbat from Sheva, okay? Hence, you've got the Passover, the Hag Matzot, the first fruits, and the Hag Shavuot. They were to refrain from any laborious work. But there's something else. It is a convocation. A convocation. The people had to assemble in order to celebrate it. Of the autumn feasts, this was a convocation, and this was a convocation. Later on, so would the Feast of Booths be a convocation. You had to come to where the Ark of God was to celebrate it, okay? You had to come, it was a pilgrim feast, you had to come to where the Ark of God was to celebrate it, okay? Feast of Trumpets, you didn't need to come to where the Ark of God was, okay? Yom Kippur, there was something that had to happen ritually with the Levites where the Ark of God was, but the other people didn't have to come as a pilgrim. But for the convocations, they had to come as pilgrim. Hence, we understand something. The idea of convocation brings us into the next aspect of Pesach. National identity as a nation and a people. So we begin with, it is a polemic. Secondly, it was a festal mechanism to engender a sense of national identity as a nation and a people. Okay? Convocation. They had to come to celebrate at a certain place. Before the temple was built, the ark was kept in a place called Shiloh. It was there for about 200 years. And we know where the ark would have been kept. It was sort of kept on a natural platform, surrounded by hills that are amphitheatrical. Over 1 million people could have sat there, and all over the ground to this day you'll find broken pieces of clay from plates. Once they ate the meals, the people would break the plates because they were festal dishes. And you can still find the chips of stone. Amazingly, all this time they're all over the place from the excavations. You're not supposed to take them, but people do come and take them. They're still there. The people had to look at the ark while they were eating the Passover in biblical times. So we're looking at these aspects then. First aspect, polemic, argument against paganism. A monotheistic argument or response to the paganism of the Canaanite nations. Second, convocation. That which engendered a sense of identity and unity as a nation and a people. Okay? During the revival of King Josiah, the people celebrate a momentous Passover. Okay. You find this several times, beginning with in the days of Joshua and so forth. The people celebrate this Passover during any times of national revival. Whenever they return to the covenant, whenever the people had gone away from the Torah, but then returned in some kind of repentance, usually after a period of some kind of judgment, which they interpreted as being divine, there was this idea of celebrating the Pesach, most notably, but not only, in the days of Josiah. The third aspect was commemoration. They were to commemorate the deliverance they received on the 14th of Nisan from Egypt, from the domain of Pharaoh, in probably the 13th century BC, before the Common Era, before Christ. Okay. So we have the aspect of polemic, the aspect of convocation, and the aspect of commemoration. Okay. In time, Jews began to think about this differently. It began to evolve beyond this in all three aspects: the polemic, the convocation, and the commemorative. From the polemic point of view, it became not only a polemic against paganism, but a polemic against Jews who paganized. From the convocational point of view, they lost the 10 tribes in the Assyrian captivity in 720 BC. They lost the throne of David in the Babylonian captivity, 586 BC. Okay? Hence, the idea of a restoration of identity as a nation and a people, convocation. So when the Jews are driven out of their land by Hadrian in the 2nd century, when they're scattered after the Bar Kokhba's rebellion in the 2nd century AD, Common Era, you see Jews emphasizing celebration of the Passover in all the countries of the diaspora where they lived and where they were scattered. Didn't matter. From Babylon to Spain, from Northern Europe to North Africa, you see them celebrating the Passover. Convocation. It was essential to preserve their identity as a nation and a people in the diaspora once they were dispossessed of their homeland. Thirdly, commemoration. When a Jew would commemorate, they would look back to the deliverance out of Egypt. But once the Babylonian captivity happened, you had this rise of messianic expectation, where they looked for a Davidic figure, a figure in the character of King David, who would restore the throne of David. This helped to push or promote the idea not just of a commemoration that looked back, but a commemoration that looked back as a way of looking forward. The same God who delivered us out of Egypt is going to deliver us again. And of course, they gave us a messianic association. You understand? The Messiah will deliver us. The same as Moses took us out of Egypt, the Messiah is going to come, take us out of the diaspora. He's going to take us out of the dispersion. You know, we had no nation and no people when we were in Egypt. We were like slaves. Well, it was always the same for Jews in the diaspora. This idea of a messianic figure who was going to come in the character of Moses and restore the Davidic promise. So it begins to develop along these lines. Polemic, convocation, commemoration take on a whole other school of meaning and thought after the Jews are driven out of their land for 2,000 years. Now, let's go further. Turn with me, please, to the book of Exodus, the 12th chapter. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be the beginning of months to you." Again, that is the month of Nisan. Hence, according to Exodus, Exodus in Hebrew is called Shemot, literally the book of names. It goes back, according to Shemot, to Egypt. "It shall be the beginning of the year to you. Speak to the congregation, saying, on the 10th of this month, They are each to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's households, a lamb for each household. Now, if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to the house are to take one according to the number of persons in them, according to what each man should eat. You are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old, and you shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now, it's interesting that goat would be eaten because that is the other sacrificial animal in the autumn feast of Yom Kippur. Nonetheless, let's continue. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight, at sundown. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts on the lintel of the houses which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, for they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left on till morning you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, against all the gods of Egypt. I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, hence Passover, and no plague will befall you or destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. They would have to take hyssop, and they would use hyssop ritually, and they would make the sign of blood on the doorpost, like a bloody cross. And the angel of death, the Malki Malvid, angel of death, English people call the Grim Reaper, would pass over. Well, this was to be commemorated. They were always to do it. It was to be a perpetual ordinance for them. They were always to remember what happened when they were delivered out of the land of Egypt. That was their birth as a nation and a people. Hence, they were commemorated to continue to celebrate it. They always went back to their origins. It's sort of like the Americans, I suppose, going back to celebrating the July 4th, or the French celebrating Bastille Day. It goes back to their origin as a nation. Again, the idea of identity. However, it was something else. We come to the fourth aspect. Covenant. Covenant. This was an ancient Near Eastern suzerainty ritual. The suzerain represents the ruler with whom you make a covenant. And it obligates the suzerain to do certain things. But the people, or whoever made the covenant with the suzerain, would also enter into obligation. These covenants were blood covenants. Blood covenants. The normal way a suzerainty ritual would have been carried out in the ancient Near East, even in pre-Mosaic times, was an animal would have been sacrificed and its carcass bisected, cut in half. And both the suzerain and the person making the covenant would pass through the two halves of the animal, of the carcass of the sacrificed animal that was blood sacrificed. This was their way of, as it were, signing a contract. Signing a contract that was a blood covenant. It was a suzerainty ritual. The suzerainty ritual required the eating of a covenant meal. The eating of a covenant meal. So the participants would be the one making the covenant and the one who initiated it, the suzerain, and the one who he's making it with. Okay? Hence, you'd have this idea of covenant. It was a covenant meal, covenant ritual. As things evolved over the centuries, again, this continued. It reminded the Jews that they were a covenant people and were in a covenant with God, whether they kept it or not. They were in a covenant. Now, there are those who would point out the significance of both Judaism and Christianity that when Yahweh made the initial covenant with Abraham in the book of Genesis, it was the Shalhevet Yah, the flame of Yahweh, that went through the two halves. Abraham didn't. Of course, there are those who would interpret it this way, saying that God foreknew that he would keep the covenant, but his people wouldn't. Hence the flame, the Shalhevet Yah, went through. There are those who would interpret it that way. Okay. Certainly there are rabbis and Christians who would interpret it that way. So it's a covenant meal. A covenant meal. Now these things begin to set the stage for the kind of thought that would emerge in the Second Temple period, particularly during the time of the Maccabees, but that would also, in turn, be adopted by Jewish Christians, by first century and second century Jewish Christians, and then taken on and culturally modified by the Gentile church. Hence you have the covenant meal, and they continue eating it. It reminds the Jews that they're in this covenant. It is commemorated to this day by a special festal liturgy called the Haggadah. In the course of eating the Passover, the whole story of Exodus and the redemption out of Egypt is told ritually in a liturgical form of storytelling with prayers and songs and so forth in a particular order of protocol called the Haggadah. Haggadah. You have an Ashkenazi one for European Jews, and you have a slightly different one, a Sephardic one, for Oriental Jews, okay? But this is the Haggadah. There would be periods that we read about in the Tanakh in the Old Testament where this was not celebrated, where it was not celebrated or observed in the way that the Torah prescribed. When it was not celebrated, it was usually as a result of some kind of national backsliding from the covenant, or as a result of some inability to observe it, which would have been interpreted as a divine judgment for having not kept the covenant. Thus, whenever there was a restoration, they'd always have to go back and try to have another Passover. So we're looking again at these four: the polemic, the convocation, the commemoration, and the covenant meal, or just covenant. As Messianic thought developed, it particularly developed during the Babylonian captivity, when the throne of David was lost and the first temple was destroyed. Messianic thought began to develop. It developed further in the post-exilic period. The post-exilic period, the period of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. Okay. A lot of changes happened in Judaism during that period. For one thing, you had the influx of Aramisms, Aramaic words, Aramaic particles of speech, Aramaic ways of saying things that began getting into the Hebrew canon. Okay? But there were also a number of traditions that were originally acquired in Babylon. Even in Babylon, Jews would have celebrated the Passover with this aspiration of national restoration. Among them were a table called a triclinium. Triclinium, where people would recline on cushions on a very low three-sided table called the triclinium, very low three-sided cushions, because only free men reclined. Okay? That would be one of the traditions of Babylon. The second would have been the liturgical development of the Haggadah. The liturgical development of the Haggadah. That would have been the other aspect of Passover that develops during the Babylonian captivity. Okay? Now, again, you have Aramaic prayers in the Sephardic Haggadah. The fact that they're Aramaic instead of Hebrew shows that they go back to this time. One of them says, Ki lakbanya. This is like the bread our fathers ate in the wilderness. Hence, you have a development of Paschal thought in Judaism. So it goes through phases. Paschal thought goes through phases. The first phase is the purely Mosaic phase. The Mosaic phase, that which was instituted by Moses. The second phase, okay, is what happens in the land during the period of judges, then during the periods of kings and prophets. Okay? This was the revivalist phase of Paschal development. Again, seen most clearly with the restoration of the observance in the reign of King Josiah. Okay? You could call this a revivalist as kind of a Christian term. Let's call it restorative or restorational. The third is the exilic phase, that which develops during the Babylonian captivity. Aramaic words and prayers being incorporated into the ritual, the development of the Haggadah, and the development of certain cultural practices for eating the meal using a triclinium and the reclining and things of this nature. It was during this period that a very formal ritual was set for how the Passover should be observed. And of course, when we look at the New Testament, we see the Last Supper follows it very closely. Okay. What I'm saying is, what you see happening in the New Testament is not something, with the Last Supper of Jesus, is not something that simply goes back to Moses, but it incorporates the way it developed and evolved over the centuries through these various phases. Okay? So you have the exilic. Then you have the post-exilic. When Ezra and Nehemiah rebuild the temple, and there's a keenness to restore the sacrificial system Levitically and so forth within the framework of temple worship. After the exilic, you have a further development of Paschal thought in Judaism. This is intertestamental, and it was brought about by the descendants and the heirs of the Maccabees. It happens intertestamentally. This would be called the Hasmonean period of development. Hence, although all of these things were inherent in the original Mosaic development of Paschal thought, they expanded, developed, evolved according to what happened to the Jews historically, anthropologically and theologically in their history, through these other phases: the restorative, the exilic, the post-exilic, and into the Hasmonean. By the time we get to the Hasmonean, the period between the Old and New Testament, okay, we have the full body of what would come about in the day of Jesus. The full body of what would come about in the day of Jesus. Why did Jesus get arrested in Jerusalem? Well, it was a pilgrim feast. He was there as a pilgrim with his disciples celebrating the Passover, because that's where the temple was. Although there was no ark anymore, that's where the temple was. It was still a pilgrim feast. They still observed it in that particular kind of way. That's Mosaic, okay? But Jesus came to give a message that he was somehow going to restore what the people were looking to have restored, howbeit not in the way they thought. He was a Davidic Messiah, but not in the sense that they thought it was a restorative, okay? The fact that Jesus himself had been in Egypt, okay, this again draws on the exilic. And the fact that he comes back out of Egypt, I call my son, that kind of thing, exilic, okay? But in the Hasmonean period is where they're really looking for a Messiah to come and bring this general messianic restoration. Hence, all of these things set the stage for the way the New Testament interprets the development of Passover within Judaism. Now again, this is purely Old Testament, purely showing how it developed, what it meant to the Jews at the time, and the stages through which the Passover expanded, developed, evolved, until we get to the time of the Second Temple period, the time of Jesus.